The garage door was already up when I pulled into the driveway at 2:14 in the morning, and for a second I just sat there in the truck, engine ticking as it cooled, watching the empty space where her Honda should have been. My name is Frank. I'm 41 years old. I run a small contracting business out of a rented lot on the east side of Boise, and 11 days before that night, my wife Rachel had walked out of a 90-day inpatient program with a chip in her pocket and a look on her face I hadn't seen since before the accident that started all of it. A look like she'd been given her life back. I'd paid $40,000 for that look. Emptied the equipment fund, took a second loan against the truck, sold my father's old Winchester that I'd sworn I'd never sell. None of it mattered at the time. I would have sold the house if it had come to that. And some nights, lying awake doing math I didn't want to do, I almost had to. She'd been home 11 days. 11 days of oatmeal in the mornings and her hand finding mine under the kitchen table and Maddie's laugh coming back into the house like something that had been folded away in a drawer for a year and finally shaken loose. 11 days of me believing, stupidly, gratefully, that the worst chapter of our marriage was already behind us, that we'd paid for it in full and could move forward now, lighter. Then I got up that night for water and found her side of the bed cold, and the garage door open to the street like an invitation nobody had accepted, and I stood in the doorway in my bare feet on the cement floor, phone in hand, dialing a number that went straight to voicemail, and something in my chest did a slow, quiet fold. Not panic yet. Just the first crack in something I didn't know was still holding. I told myself she couldn't sleep. I told myself she went to get gas, or she'd had a nightmare and needed air, or a dozen other sentences built entirely out of hope and none out of evidence. I stood there a long time telling myself things, the concrete cold enough that I could feel it climbing up through my heels, and somewhere in the house behind me the refrigerator hummed its steady, indifferent hum, the only honest sound in the place. She didn't answer until 4:47 a.m. "I'm fine," she said, voice too bright, too fast, the words arriving slightly ahead of the breath that should have carried them. "Couldn't sleep. Went for a drive." I said okay. I said I understood. I hung up and sat on the edge of the bed until the sky started going the color of dishwater outside the window, and I didn't sleep again that night. And some part of me, the part that would spend the next 6 weeks lying to itself in increasingly elaborate ways, already knew that "went for a drive" was going to become the first thread in something I wasn't ready to pull. I want you to understand what our life looked like before that night, because it matters, not as an excuse for anything that came later, but because a man doesn't build a life this specific by accident. And I think the specificity is where the real damage lies. We'd been married 11 years. Rachel and I met at a friend's barbecue in our late 20s, back when I was still working for someone else's contracting outfit, and she was finishing her physical therapy license. And there was a directness to her that I'd never encountered in another person before or since. She asked me questions like she actually wanted the answers, which sounds like a low bar until you've dated enough people who don't. We got married 2 years later in her parents' backyard in Nampa, small and unfussy, and Maddie came along 6 years after that, a surprise that stopped being a surprise the moment we saw her. The accident happened 18 months before that 2 a.m. phone call. Rachel had been helping a patient transfer from a wheelchair. She'd built a career doing home health PT, the kind of work that requires a strong back and an infinite patience, and something in her own spine gave out in a way that required 2 surgeries and a recovery that never fully arrived. The oxycodone was supposed to last 2 weeks after the second surgery. It didn't. By the time either of us admitted out loud what was happening, she'd been supplementing her prescription through other channels for the better part of a year, and I hadn't seen it. Not because I wasn't watching, but because I was watching for the wrong things. I was watching for a woman falling apart, and instead I got a woman who became, if anything, more organized, more controlled, more precisely herself in every visible way, while something underneath all that precision quietly came undone. That's the first thing I'd tell anyone who thinks addiction looks like the movies. It doesn't. It looks like your wife making dinner on time every night and never once forgetting Maddie's soccer schedule. The intervention, when it finally happened, came from her sister Beth, who'd noticed things I'd been too close to see. A slur late at night that Rachel blamed on wine. A missing week's worth of pills that should have lasted a month. A strange rigidity that would come over her some evenings like she was holding herself together through sheer force of will. I remember sitting in Beth's living room 3 days before the intervention, going over what we'd say, and feeling like the floor of my own life had quietly been replaced with something thinner while I wasn't looking. Rachel didn't fight us. That surprised me more than anything. I'd braced for denial, for anger, for the kind of scene you brace for when you're about to tell someone you love that you've seen through the version of them they've been performing. Instead, she sat very still, listened to all three of us, and said, "Okay, I need help." 2 words that cost her, I understood later, more than I could have imagined at the time. 90 days at a facility outside Twin Falls. Weekly family therapy calls that I drove 3 hours round trip for, every single week, without missing one. $40,000 that came from every corner of our life I could scrape it from. And at the end of it, a woman who walked out of that building looking like she'd been returned to herself. I introduced myself, my age, my work, because none of it protected me from what came next, and I think that matters too. I wasn't a fool who wasn't paying attention. I was a man who had already spent everything he had, money, time, faith, on believing the worst was over, and that kind of belief, once you've built it that expensively, doesn't come down easily even when the evidence starts arriving to take it apart brick by brick. The morning after that first 2 a.m. disappearance, she came home at 6, smelling of gas station coffee, and something else underneath it I couldn't name yet, something sweeter, almost floral, that didn't belong to any of the products in our bathroom. She kissed my cheek like nothing had happened. Maddie was already up, cartoons murmuring from the living room, and Rachel moved into the kitchen and started making pancakes like she did every Tuesday. And I stood in the doorway watching my wife's hands work the batter, steady as anything, not a tremor in them, and thought, maybe this really is nothing. Maybe I'm the one with the problem now, seeing shadows where there's only a woman trying to rebuild a life. I wanted so badly for it to be nothing. I understand now that wanting something to be nothing is its own kind of blindness. When I built myself, brick by willing brick, out of 11 days of good mornings I wasn't ready to lose. She caught me watching her that morning and smiled, a real smile, easy and warm, and said, "What?" And I said, "Nothing, just glad you're home," and meant it completely. And that was the last morning for a long while that I would mean something so simple so completely. The weeks that followed had a strange, brittle normalcy to them, the kind where everyone in the house is performing a version of okay, so committed that it starts to feel indistinguishable from the real thing. Rachel went to her outpatient meetings on Tuesdays and Thursdays, a program at a community center on the west side that her inpatient counselors had lined up before she left Twin Falls. She started jogging again, 3 miles at dawn, her old running shoes resurrected from the back of the closet where they'd sat untouched since before the surgeries. She read to Maddie every night, doing voices for each character in a way that made our daughter shriek with laughter. And some evenings I'd stand in the hallway just listening, thinking I had gotten my family back whole, that the money and the terror and the 3-hour drives to Twin Falls had bought exactly what they were supposed to buy. I went back to work in earnest that first month, picking up a kitchen remodel in Eagle and a deck rebuild out near the foothills, grateful for the exhaustion that came with physical labor because it left less room in my head for the low static of worry that had lived there since her diagnosis. I told myself the static would fade with time. I told myself a lot of things that spring. But there were things, small things, the kind of things you notice and then talk yourself out of noticing, because noticing them means admitting a possibility you're not prepared to hold. She started keeping her phone face down on the kitchen counter, something she'd never done before in 11 years of marriage. When I asked about her sponsor, a woman named Denise who I'd never actually met, but who came up constantly in conversation, her answers came a half-second too fast, like she'd rehearsed them somewhere before I asked the question. A smoothness that didn't match the halting, careful way Rachel usually talked about anything related to her recovery. Twice I glanced at the mileage on her car and found it higher than it should have been for the errands she'd described that day, a gap of 20, 30 miles that didn't map onto a trip to the pharmacy and back. I didn't ask, not because I didn't want to know, but because I was afraid of the answer, and because 11 days, then 3 weeks, then a month of good mornings and pancakes felt too fragile to risk breaking with a question I might not survive the answer to. I told myself this was patience. I understand now it was something closer to cowardice wearing patience's clothes, though I wouldn't have called it that then, and I'm not sure I could have called it anything else and kept functioning. One Thursday, she came back from her meeting flushed, talking fast about how proud Denise was of her progress, about a woman in the group who'd relapsed and how it had scared everyone into recommitting. And when she hugged me hello, I noticed her hands were trembling slightly, the way they used to before, in the bad months before the intervention. I told myself it was just relief or secondhand fear from watching someone else struggle. Emotional meetings did that to people. I held her a little tighter and told myself the trembling was a good sign, evidence of a woman still fighting hard enough to feel things. Looking back now, that was the moment I should have asked the question I kept avoiding. I called it emotion then. I wouldn't call it that anymore. Money started disappearing in small amounts. 40 here, 60 there. From the joint checking account, always cash withdrawals, always round numbers. I noticed it the way you notice a picture hanging slightly crooked on a wall you pass a dozen times a day. Aware, mildly bothered, unwilling to get up and fix it because fixing it would require stopping what you're doing and actually looking directly at the thing. She said it was gas, incidentals, a birthday gift for Denise that she wanted to buy in cash because it felt more personal. I nodded. I signed off on my own blindness with a nod, over and over, small transaction by small transaction, and called the whole arrangement trust. I didn't ask. I smiled. Even though inside I wanted to ask 100 questions, because it was easier that way, and because some part of me had already decided that the price of certainty might be higher than the price of not knowing. There was a night in the 5th week I woke at 1 a.m. and she wasn't in bed. I found her sitting in the dark kitchen, phone lit up in her hands, the blue light throwing strange shadows across her face. And when I asked who she was texting, she said, "Denise, she's having a hard night." And put the phone face down so fast the motion itself told me something her words didn't. A reflex too quick to be innocent, too practiced to be new. I went back to bed. I didn't ask again. I lay there listening to the house settle around me and told myself I was being paranoid, that a man who'd nearly lost his wife to addiction 18 months earlier had earned the right to be a little jumpy. That jumpiness wasn't the same thing as truth. Something tightened in me that night that never fully let go, a low, dull knot somewhere behind my sternum that I got so used to carrying I nearly forgot it was there. The way you forget the weight of a watch on your wrist until someone asks you the time. I want to stop here for a second, because if you've ever caught yourself building an entire alternate reality out of small, deniable explanations, gas station coffee, a sponsor's bad night, cash for a birthday gift, just so you wouldn't have to face what was underneath them, you already know exactly what that felt like. It isn't stupidity. It's a kind of self-preservation that costs you more than it protects, and I don't think I understood that trait at the time. I thought I was being a good husband. I was actually just buying myself a few more weeks of not knowing, at a price I hadn't yet been told. By the end of that second month, the pattern had a shape, even if I still refused to trace its outline out loud. Thursdays became the day she came home latest, always with an explanation that sat just on the edge of plausible. A longer conversation after group, a flat tire she'd already fixed herself before I could offer to help, traffic on Fairview that I couldn't verify one way or the other. I started, without quite admitting it to myself, keeping a mental log. 20 minutes late, 40 minutes late, an hour. Once, explained by a phone call with her mother that ran long, a call I had no way to confirm had happened at all. I told myself I needed more before I said anything. That accusing a woman 2 months out of a 90-day program of relapsing, or worse, without real proof, could undo everything we'd fought for, could send her spiraling in exactly the direction I was terrified of, over what might turn out to be nothing but my own anxiety talking. That reasoning felt sound to me then. I still think there was truth in it. But I also understand now that it was a shield, built with real care and real love, that protected me as much as it protected her, because as long as I hadn't asked, I hadn't heard an answer I couldn't take back. Maddie, in the way children have of seeing straight through the careful architecture adults build around them, started asking small questions of her own. "Is Mom okay?" she asked me one evening while I tucked her in, apropos of nothing I could identify. I told her Mom was doing great, getting stronger every day. Maddie considered this with the seriousness only an 8-year-old can bring to a conversation, then said, "She seems far away sometimes," and rolled over and went to sleep, leaving me sitting on the edge of her bed with a sentence I would carry for weeks. I didn't repeat it to Rachel. I didn't know what I would have done with her answer. She told me, much later, what the outpatient group actually looked like from the inside during those first weeks. Something I want to lay out here because it matters to understanding what came after, even though I didn't learn any of it until far too late to change anything. I want you to understand something about that room, because from the outside it just looked like folding chairs and bad coffee, and people saying the same sentences over and over until they started to sound like nothing at all. From the inside, it was the first place in over a year where nobody looked at me like I was something fragile that needed managing. Frank looked at me like I might break. My mother looked at me like I already had. Even Beth, God love her, looked at me like a project she'd successfully completed. Marcus didn't look at me like any of that. He was 3 weeks ahead of me in the program, recovering from a back injury of his own that had gone the same route mine had. And the first time he spoke in group about the specific shame of needing something your own body used to give you for free, I felt something crack open in my chest that I hadn't let anyone near in months. It wasn't romantic yet. I want to be honest about that. It was just relief, the specific relief of being seen by someone who wasn't grading my recovery against how scared he was of losing me. I told myself that talking to him after group, in the parking lot, staying an extra 20 minutes some Thursdays, was just support. That's the lie you tell yourself first, before any of the others. That this doesn't count if it's just talking, if nobody finds out, if you go right back to being who you're supposed to be by the time you pull into your own driveway. That's what she told me. I knew none of it yet. I was home during those parking lot conversations, making dinner, checking the clock, telling myself the extra 20 minutes was Denise having a hard night. By the 5th week, the small inconsistencies had accumulated into something with a shape, even if I still refused to name it out loud, even to myself, especially to myself. Maddie was the one who said it first, in that offhand, devastating way children have of stating the obvious without understanding its weight. We were driving home from her soccer practice, the late April light going gold over the foothills, and she said, from the back seat, without any particular urgency, "Mom's been going to a lot of meetings." And I said, yes, that's good. Meetings help her stay healthy. And Maddie said, but she doesn't come back smelling like the church basement anymore. She smells like the candle shop. I laughed it off in the car, made some comment about new soap or a different laundry detergent, and Maddie accepted it the way kids accept most adult explanations, without real scrutiny. I did not laugh it off later, lying awake next to Rachel's sleeping shape, running the sentence over in my head like a stone in my palm, turning it, feeling its edges, unable to put it down. I started paying closer attention after that, and hated myself a little for it, because attention felt like a betrayal of the trust I'd told myself I was rebuilding with her, day by day, meeting by meeting. I checked the odometer more than I wanted to admit. I checked the bank app more than once a day, watching for those small round number cash withdrawals, cataloging them without confronting them. I told myself I was being a good partner, staying engaged in her recovery the way the family therapy sessions had encouraged me to. I understand now that I was building a case, quietly, methodically, in a part of myself I wasn't proud of and didn't examine too closely. Her sponsor, Denise, it turned out, ran her Thursday group at the same community center on the west side. I knew this because I dropped Rachel off there once myself, weeks earlier, in the good days right after she came home, when driving her places still felt like an act of devotion rather than surveillance. One Thursday afternoon, I found myself driving past that same building on my way to a job estimate on the other side of town, a detour I told myself was coincidental, and the parking lot was nearly empty. Group didn't start for another hour. Rachel's Honda wasn't there yet either way, which meant nothing on its own, except that it meant I'd started looking, and once you start looking you don't stop. That detail seemed insignificant at the time. It wasn't. I didn't confront her that week or the week after. I told myself I needed more before I said anything. That accusing a woman not yet 3 months out of a 90-day program of relapsing, or of something else entirely, without solid proof, could unravel everything we'd both fought so hard to hold together. That reasoning was sincere. It was also, I understand now, a shield I built to protect myself from an answer I already half suspected and didn't yet have the strength to carry into daylight. She started coming home later with more regularity now, 20 minutes, then 40, then once nearly 90, always with an explanation that arrived smooth and complete, the way a story sounds when it's been told before it's been asked for. Traffic on Fairview. A longer one-on-one with Denise after the group broke up. A flat tire she'd already fixed by the time I offered to come help, which struck me, even then, as slightly strange. Rachel had never in 11 years changed a tire herself, had always called me first, and now apparently could handle a roadside emergency alone in the time it took her to drive home. Always plausible, never quite provable, and never quite disprovable either, which I would later understand was exactly the space she needed to operate in, a gap wide enough to drive an entire second life through without ever quite catching on the edges. I remember one Saturday, working alongside her in the backyard while she pulled weeds from the garden bed with an intensity that seemed to exceed the task, and I asked, as casually as I could manage, how things were going with Denise, and she said, "Really good, actually. She thinks I'm doing better than most people at this stage." A half-second pause before better, almost imperceptible, the kind of pause I would have missed entirely 8 weeks earlier and now heard like a struck bell. I didn't push. I asked instead about the group members, generic small talk, and she answered readily enough. Names of people I'd never meet, stories of relapse and recovery that all had the texture of things repeated rather than things freshly remembered. I told myself this was normal, that a support group's stories become communal property, retold and worn smooth by repetition. I still believe that's often true. I no longer believe it was the whole truth of what I was hearing. Something tightened in me that night that never fully let go, a low, dull knot behind my sternum I'd gotten so used to carrying that I nearly forgot it was there. There was an evening, a Tuesday, when Rachel came home not from a meeting but from what she called a grocery run, and I noticed, helping her carry bags in from the car, a receipt fallen on the passenger floor mat for a coffee shop I didn't recognize, 2 drinks listed, one of them a name I'd never known her to order. I picked it up before she could, held it a beat too long, and she took it from my hand with a smile that arrived a half-second late and said, "Oh, that's for meeting a friend from group. We grabbed coffee after." I should have mentioned it. She should have. She hadn't. I filed the absence away with everything else I was filing away, a growing archive of things that individually meant nothing and collectively meant something I still wasn't ready to say out loud. I called it a coincidence then. I wouldn't call it that anymore. By the end of that 5th week, I had started keeping a private, unspoken tally, dates, times, discrepancies, the small evidence of a life running parallel to the one I thought I was living inside. I hated the tally. I kept it anyway, because some animal part of me understood, before the rest of me was willing to catch up, that something was building toward a shape I would eventually have to look at directly. The turn came by accident, the way Rachel's addiction itself had started by accident. A torn ACL, a surgery, a bottle of oxycodone that should have lasted 2 weeks and didn't. I wasn't looking for proof that particular Thursday. I was looking for the truck's registration, which Rachel had borrowed from my glove compartment folder weeks earlier to help file some insurance paperwork. And in moving her folder aside on the kitchen table, I found the receipt sitting loose between 2 unrelated documents, as if it had been filed there almost by reflex and then forgotten. A charge from a motel off Fairview Avenue, dated the previous Thursday. $89. For a long moment, I just held it, feeling nothing at all, which is its own kind of feeling, the flatline before the storm makes landfall, the strange calm quiet that arrives right before your whole understanding of your life is about to be rearranged. I set it down on the table and looked at it the way you'd look at an object that had appeared from nowhere, trying to construct an innocent explanation before I'd even fully registered what I was looking at. I didn't tell her. I told myself I needed to be sure before I said anything that couldn't be unsaid, and some colder, more clinical part of me, a part one didn't recognize in myself and am not entirely proud of, even now, took over from whatever had been running the show until that point. I pulled 3 months of bank statements that evening after she'd gone to bed, sitting at the kitchen table with my laptop, the house dark and silent around me. I found 6 more charges at the same motel, always Thursdays, always under $50 in cash withdrawn the same afternoon, as if she'd learned at some point, through trial or instinct, not to leave a clean card trail. I found a second phone bill tucked into an old shoebox in the hall closet where she kept tax documents, a number I didn't recognize, calls logged for hours at a time on nights. She'd told me she couldn't sleep and had gone for a drive instead. Every apparent lead felt like it might collapse under me the moment I examined it too closely. Maybe it was some kind of intensive counseling I didn't know about, held at odd hours in an odd location for privacy reasons. Maybe the second number belonged to Denise after all, a new phone, a work line, something with an explanation I simply hadn't been given yet. I wanted, even then, even holding 6 weeks of receipts in my hand, to be wrong. Wanting to be wrong is its own kind of devotion, and I understand now that devotion isn't always a virtue. Sometimes it's just fear wearing a nicer name, dressed up to look like faith so you don't have to call it what it is. I called the motel directly the next morning from my truck in a job site parking lot, told the woman at the front desk I was trying to confirm a reservation for my accounting records, gave Rachel's full name. The woman on the other end, tired and entirely unbothered by the strangeness of the request, confirmed a standing weekly booking, room 114, under Rachel Hargrove, for the past 5 consecutive weeks, sometimes 6. She couldn't be sure without pulling the full log. I sat in my truck outside my own job site for 40 minutes without moving, engine off, hands on the wheel like I was driving somewhere, going nowhere at all. I realized then that I hadn't been protecting our recovery these past 2 months. I'd been protecting my own ability to keep believing in it, because the alternative, that the $40,000, the sold rifle, the 11 good days that had stretched into 2 good months, all of it, might have simply run alongside a second life I knew nothing about, was more than I had been ready to hold. I had spent years being good at the wrong things, at keeping the peace, at not asking, at making everything look fine from the outside, even when something underneath had already started coming apart. That's not a virtue either, I understand now. It's just another shape fear can take. I photographed everything that week with a methodical calm that frightened me a little, even as I did it. The receipts, laid flat and photographed one by one. The bank statements, relevant transactions circled in red pen. The phone bill, the unfamiliar number highlighted. The call durations added up in the margin in my own handwriting. 4 hours one Thursday alone. I didn't say a word to Rachel. I watched her make pancakes that Tuesday and read to Maddie that night in her 3 different character voices. Watched her move through our house with the same steady hands she'd always had, and some part of me that used to love watching that now just watched it, clinically, like evidence being logged for a case I hadn't yet decided how I'd argue. There was a moment that week, a moment I only understood the shape of much later, that I want to include here because it runs parallel to everything I was discovering on my own. The Thursday Frank called the motel, I almost told him everything myself, unprompted, before he ever said a word. I'd started to feel the walls of it closing in, small details slipping, a receipt I couldn't remember whether I'd thrown away, a look Frank had given me over dinner that lasted a half-second too long. I sat in my car outside the house that evening, engine off, phone in my lap, and I actually typed out the beginning of a text to him. There's something I need to tell you. I looked at those 7 words for almost a full minute. Then I deleted them, because Marcus had texted right at that moment. Something small and ordinary, and the fear of losing that. Of losing the one place where I didn't feel like a project or a patient or a cautionary tale, outweighed, in that specific minute, the fear of Frank finding out on his own. I told myself I'd tell him when I was ready, on my own terms, in my own time. I didn't understand yet that I had already run out of time to control how this would be discovered. That's what she told me. I didn't know, that Thursday evening, how close she'd come to walking through our front door and telling me everything herself. I was in the kitchen with Maddie's math homework spread across the table, entirely unaware that 40 feet away, in a parked car, my wife was deciding not to save us. I waited until Maddie was safely at her grandmother's for the weekend before I laid it out. I didn't want our daughter anywhere near the house for what I already knew was coming, even if I couldn't yet have described its exact shape. I didn't yell. I set the folder on the kitchen table, the motel receipt on top, the bank statements beneath it, the phone bill circled in red, and I said, room 114. Every Thursday for 5 weeks, maybe 6. Explain it to me. She went very still, the stillness of someone doing rapid calculations behind an otherwise composed face. It's not what it looks like, she said, and picked up the receipt, turning it over as if the back of it might offer a different story than the front. Then tell me what it looks like. She said it was a support meeting Denise had recommended, off the books, more intensive than the regular group, that met at the motel's conference room because the community center was double booked most Thursdays. I asked why there was no conference room charge on any statement. Only a nightly room rate. Room 114, the same room every time. She said she didn't know how the motel's billing system worked, that maybe they just charged everything the same way regardless of the room's use. I asked about the second phone number, the hours of calls. She said it was a burner Denise had given her for emergency sponsor calls, so that Marcus. She caught herself on the name a half-second too late, and the kitchen went so quiet I could hear the refrigerator hum, the same indifferent hum from that first 2 a.m. morning 2 months earlier, the only honest thing in the room. "Who's Marcus?" I said. Not a question. A door already opening onto something neither of us could close again. She tried to walk it back, said he was just someone from her outpatient group, someone who'd helped her stay accountable during a hard stretch, that it wasn't what I was clearly imagining, that I was twisting something supportive into something ugly because, and here her voice sharpened, found an edge I recognized from arguments years old, long buried, because I'd never fully trusted her recovery in the first place. Had been waiting this whole time for a reason to believe the worst. I placed the phone bill in front of her, the hours logged beside his number circled in red. She said those were long calls, relapse prevention conversations, the kind of thing that runs late when someone's struggling. I placed the motel confirmation in front of her, 5, maybe 6, consecutive Thursdays under her own name. She said maybe, it had started as something small and gotten complicated, that it wasn't really an affair so much as two people in early recovery leaning on each other in a way that got away from both of them, that it happened, not that she'd made it happen, as though the distinction mattered, as though something could simply happen to a person for 6 consecutive Thursdays without a single deliberate choice involved. Each time she shifted her version, meeting, then burner phone, then relapse prevention calls, then something that merely happened. I set another piece of paper on the table between us, wordless, methodical. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I watched a woman I had given everything to run out of room to move, one receipt at a time, and I felt something in my chest go very quiet and very final, quieter than anger, colder than grief. The sound of something that had been holding on for 2 months, finally letting go all at once. "I need you to stop reframing this," I said, my own voice steadier than I expected it to be, "and just tell me the truth. All of it. Right now. In order, from the beginning." She was quiet for a long moment, staring at the papers spread across the table like a hand of cards she'd been forced to lay face up. Then she said, "Okay." And something in the word itself sounded different from everything that had come before it. Not another deflection dressed up as agreement, but something closer to surrender. She finally spoke. This is what she told me, as close to her exact words as memory allows 2 years of distance to preserve. It started the 3rd week of outpatient. "I was scared all the time, Frank. Scared of you looking at me like I was fragile. Scared of costing you anything else after everything you'd already given up to get me back." Marcus didn't see the person who needed saving. He saw someone who was just trying, the same as him. The first time we sat in his car in the parking lot after group, instead of going straight home, I told myself it was harmless. Just talking. Because talking wasn't the drug, and I needed something that wasn't the drug to fill the space it used to fill, and I told myself that made it different. It didn't. Then it became the motel. I told myself it was the last time, every single Thursday, for 5 weeks, maybe 6. I actually lost count somewhere in there, which should tell you something. I withdrew cash so there wouldn't be a card trail, and I want you to know how deliberate that was, because I think you deserve to know I wasn't sleepwalking into this. I knew exactly what I was hiding, and exactly from whom, every single time. There were mornings I couldn't look at Maddie's drawings on the refrigerator. I'd stand there with my coffee and just look somewhere else, anywhere else, because looking at her horses and her stick-figure families felt like something I'd forfeited the right to see clearly. The shame wasn't abstract, Frank. It was specific. It was standing in my own kitchen, in my own home, unable to look at my daughter's crayon drawings. I tried to stop it twice. Told him it was over, told myself the same thing. Both times I went back within the week. I don't have a good reason for that. I have an explanation. The fear, the loneliness in recovery that nobody warns you about. The way he made me feel like a person instead of a patient. But I know an explanation isn't the same thing as a good reason, and I'm not going to sit here and pretend it is. That's what she told me. I sat there afterward for a long time without saying anything at all, the kitchen clock ticking through a silence that felt like it belonged to some other, slower version of time. Beth, Rachel's sister, found out that same weekend. Rachel called her that night, apparently needing to say it out loud to someone who wasn't me, and Beth's reaction, when she called me 2 days later, was a mixture of fury on my behalf and a grief of her own I hadn't expected, grief for the sister she'd fought so hard to help save who had, in her words, thrown it back at the both of us. She didn't ask me to forgive Rachel. She didn't ask me to leave her either. She just said, "I'm so sorry, Frank." And that was somehow worse than if she'd told me what to do. Rachel's mother, when it eventually reached her, took a different position entirely. She called me, tearful, asking me to consider the addiction as a mitigating factor, reminding me how far Rachel had come, how relapse sometimes wore unfamiliar faces. I understood the impulse behind it. I couldn't accept the argument. An affair conducted with that much precision, the cash withdrawals, the standing weekly reservation, the burner phone, wasn't a symptom of relapse. It was a second life, built with the same clear-eyed competence Rachel brought to everything else she did. I didn't sleep in the house that night. I sat in the truck in the driveway until the sky went the color of dishwater again, the same as it had 2 months earlier, and I understood that I was watching the same sunrise from the outside of something I used to be inside of. Marcus, it turned out, had a wife of his own in a neighboring county. Rachel said she hadn't known, and I no longer had the appetite to weigh whether that was true. Within 2 months, his own marriage dissolved in a small, ugly way that made its way back to Rachel through their shared recovery circle, secondhand and entirely unrequested. Whatever he'd offered her in that motel room evaporated the moment there was nothing convenient left for him to offer. He stopped attending the outpatient group entirely rather than face what remained of it, and disappeared from Rachel's life as completely and unceremoniously as he'd entered it. Rachel lost more than the marriage in the months that followed. She lost Maddie's easy, unguarded trust. Our daughter, without ever being told the specifics, started watching her mother with a wariness that broke something in me to witness, because I recognized it immediately. It was the same wariness I now carried myself, worn into a child's face far too young. She lost the story she'd told herself about who she'd become in recovery, the woman who'd fought her way back and had earned, in her own mind, the credit for it outright. That credit, she understood by the end, she would have to earn a second time, slowly, with no guarantee anyone would extend it to her again. I filed for divorce 6 weeks later. I didn't drain the accounts or make a scene in front of Maddie or say things designed to wound rather than inform. I simply, quietly, began building a life that didn't require me to check odometers or scan bank statements at midnight to know where I actually stood with the person sleeping beside me. I want to stop here and tell you something I only fully understood many months later, once the divorce was final and the worst of the anger had burned down into something calmer and more useful. I used to think love meant staying no matter what came, that leaving meant I'd failed at some fundamental test of devotion. I understand now that staying isn't always love. Sometimes it's just fear dressed up in loyalty's clothes. The same fear that kept me from asking the question at 4:47 in the morning that first night, because I already knew, somewhere underneath the hope, what the answer might cost me. I paid $40,000 to save my wife's life, and if I'm honest, I would do it again without hesitation, exactly as I did it the first time. But I finally understood, sitting in that truck watching the sky lighten for the second time, that saving someone's life and remaining married to them are not the same obligation, and conflating the two very nearly cost me my own sense of who I was. If you've ever mistaken your own silence for patience, or your fear of an answer for faith in the person you loved, I think you already know exactly what those 11 weeks felt like from the inside. The strange arithmetic of hoping and dreading in equal measure every single day. I think about the crooked picture a lot now, the one I noticed and chose not to straighten, month after month, because straightening it meant admitting I'd seen it crooked in the first place. I think most of us have a version of that picture hanging somewhere in our lives, something we've noticed and decided, consciously or not, to leave exactly as it is. The question worth asking isn't really whether we'll notice it. We usually do, eventually, whether we want to or not. The real question is how long we'll let it hang there, slightly wrong, before we finally reach up and either fix it or walk away from the wall entirely and build somewhere new. I left, in the end, and Maddie and I built something new together, just the two of us most weeks now. Pancakes on Tuesdays becoming our own tradition instead of the one that used to belong to a family of three. I don't know for certain whether Rachel found her way back to steady ground in the time since. I heard, through Beth, that she's still in recovery, still attending meetings, has moved to a different city for a fresh start of her own. I stopped checking the details a while ago. Some doors close on their own once you finally stop holding them open. There's a particular kind of contradiction Frank carried without ever quite naming it. A man who ran toward danger without hesitation when it came to saving his wife's physical life, and who then spent 11 weeks flinching away from a far smaller danger. A single direct question that might have ended the uncertainty months sooner. What this story ultimately reveals isn't really about addiction, or even about betrayal specifically. It's about the peculiar exchange rate people set up in their own minds between the cost of an answer and the cost of not knowing. Frank had already paid so much, in dollars and in fear, to bring Rachel home that some part of him genuinely believed the debt was settled, that the universe owed his family a period of uncomplicated recovery in exchange for everything already spent. That belief, understandable as it was, became its own blind spot. Not because it was foolish, but because it made every early warning sign feel like an insult to how much he'd already sacrificed, rather than information he needed. Rachel's arc complicates any simple reading of villain and victim. Her addiction and her affair were not the same failure wearing two faces. Whatever the surface similarities in secrecy and self-deception, the compulsion that drove one doesn't excuse the calculation that sustained the other, the cash withdrawals, and the standing reservation, revealing a level of ongoing, deliberate choice that a purely compulsive relapse wouldn't require. And yet there's something worth sitting with in what she needed and didn't get, a place where she wasn't defined entirely by what she'd survived, where someone looked at her as capable rather than fragile. That need was real. It didn't obligate anyone else to meet it the way she chose to meet it. The accumulation here is instructive. No single Thursday, no single receipt, would have told the whole story. It was the pattern, the slow stacking of small inconsistencies that individually explained themselves away and collectively became undeniable, that finally broke through Frank's resistance to seeing clearly. Most collapses of trust work this way. Not one betrayal, but 100 small, deniable ones, each one small enough to survive scrutiny alone. What lingers longest from this story is the image of a man discovering that love and rescue aren't the same debt, and that paying one in full doesn't obligate you to keep paying the other indefinitely. That distinction, once seen, tends to follow a person quietly into every relationship that comes after. The detail that stays with me most, thinking back on all of it now, isn't the motel receipt or the burner phone. It's Maddie in the back seat of the car, mentioning offhand that her mother smelled like a candle shop instead of a church basement, having no idea she was handing her father the first real thread of something he'd spent 2 more months unraveling. Kids notice everything. They just don't always know what they're looking at, and neither, most of the time, do we. I think the real question this story leaves me with isn't why Rachel did what she did. People in pain make choices that surprise even themselves, and I've made my peace with not fully understanding hers. The question I keep coming back to is why it took me 11 weeks to ask a question I could have asked in the first 5 minutes. And I think the honest answer is that some part of me already knew, and was simply buying time against a truth I wasn't ready to carry. If there's a red flag from your own life that looks obvious now, but didn't at the time, the crooked picture you walked past for months before finally looking at it straight on, I'd genuinely like to know what it was. Drop one word in the comments for it. And to whoever stayed with me through all of this, thank you, specifically, for sitting with a story about the difference between saving someone and staying with them. That distinction cost me more than I expected it to. I hope it cost you less.